Alrighty everybody, welcome back to another video, and in this one we're going to be going over some styling and linting related tools, really just setting up our project to keep our code consistent and clean no matter how many developers we have on our team. So with that being said, let's hop into our first tool, which is EditorConfig. So you may be asking the same question that apparently a lot of people have asked, and that is, what is EditorConfig? And I really hate just reading from, kind of like whenever you have a slideshow and you have a bunch of text on there and they're just reading it, like, is this necessary? But this really is the best explanation, where it helps maintain consistent coding styles for multiple developers across various editors and IDEs. So that sounds pretty cool. So how exactly do we use it? Well, before we hop into that, check this out. A little cool thing I want to mention, and that's this. Boom, no plugin necessary. We don't have to install everything. Check it out. These editors come bundled with native support for EditorConfig. Everything should just work. Love that. So with that being said, now let's go ahead and figure out how to use this bad boy. So to actually set this up, go ahead and create a new file named EditorConfig. And this, of course, is where all of our configurations are going to go. Now, the first line I want you to write is this: root equals true. Autocomplete. Didn't even know that. That's pretty cool. So what this signifies right here is that this is the most top level EditorConfig file. Now, I say this because we can, and I'm not going to be setting up the project this way. I never do really, but if you wanted to, you can actually have separate EditorConfig files nested inside different packages or directories. And whenever you have those, it's going to take the settings from that file and apply it to that scope, whatever directory it's in. However, because we don't do any of that, I'm just going to signify root equals true. And the reason I do this is because whenever EditorConfig is going to kind of scan your project and look for all these EditorConfig files, whenever it reaches one that says root equals true, it's going to say, oh, this is the top level one. I don't need to search anymore. So that's all I'm signifying right here. And now we can get into the good stuff, which is, the actual rules for making our code consistent and clean. So how do we do this? Well, for each file type, we are going to have a wildcard pattern to pretty much say what rules or what kind of files are these rules going to apply to. So in my project, I'm going to have HTML files, Python files, and you really don't even have to plan ahead, because anytime you create a new file type, you can just go ahead and update it in this file. But just for an example, for HTML files, I say I want the character set UTF-8. I'm really loving this autocomplete, by the way. For the indent size, we'll go with 4, like that for HTML files. For indent style, we can do space. And for max line length, I'll go 119. All right, so basically wildcard pattern to say what kind of files are you making these rules for, and then you make all the rules. Now, I'm also going to take these same rules and apply it to Python files as well. So for my Python files, I also want this UTF-8 character set, just your standard characters that are, on your keyboard. Let's see, indent size 4, space 119. Okay, now, another thing that I want to mention is that since we have these rules repeated and we're pretty much applying the same ones to HTML and Python, we can indeed shorten this up a bit by, instead of saying star dot then your file extension, you can have curly braces and say HTML and PY, and now we can remove this and it's the exact equivalent. And what the heck is this eye looking at me for? Okay, it's creeping me out. But anyways, last thing I want to mention before we move on to the next tool is that if you set up your project by kind of just following along to this point and your IDE still isn't picking up these changes, then it's likely that you need to go into your settings and just, well, for JetBrains, it's at editor code style. And then here you can see this little checkbox, enable EditorConfig support. And also it's a warning, but it's not really a warning. It's exactly what we want. It's saying settings may be overridden by EditorConfig. I'm not going to disable that because, like I said, that's exactly the behavior that we want. So I'm not sure where this setting is in other IDEs, but just know that if it isn't picking it up, you probably need to go into your settings and specify that somewhere. But yeah, with that being said, this is really all we need to do for EditorConfig, and there you go. Now the next tool that we're going to be working with is something that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and that is Flake8. So Flake8, just like a lot of these other tools, it's a tool to keep your code consistent and clean. And for this one, we actually do need to install. So I'm just going to run poetry add, and I'm going to install it as a dev dependency since we don't need this in our final build push up to production. It's really just for, you know, developers to make sure their code's consistent. So add minus capital D, and the package is just called Flake8. So again, whenever we do this, it's not only going to add it to our PyProject Toml, but also install that. So that's pretty cool. All right. Now, actually, let me just go ahead and make sure. Yes, it is installed as a dev dependency. Beautiful. So just to actually make sure that this is working correctly, if you do poetry run, the command to run this tool is Flake8. However, I'm just going to go ahead and say -- help just to make sure that yes, it indeed looks like this is working correctly. All right. So check it out. Now let's go ahead and kind of get a glimpse of what Flake8 does for us in action. So what I'm going to have you do is go into any, it doesn't really matter right now, just go into any of your Python files and just add a bunch of random blank lines, just so it's going to throw some styling warnings. And then back in your terminal, if you say poetry run Flake8, just go ahead and write the path to that file. So that file that I just messed up was in core manage. So I'm just going to go ahead and say flake, or in other words, check this file for issues. Hit enter, and it says, yes, indeed. In this file, you have way too many blank lines. You have 12. That is absurd. Let's just go ahead and fix that up. Check it out. Now, whenever I run Flake8 again, I don't get any issues. Beautiful. So that's kind of the gist of what Flake8 does. However, we don't want to set this up exactly in that way, where we have to run everything from the command line all the time. Now, actually, another thing that I want to mention before I begin is that you know how we can run this checker on an individual file using this format? If you ever want to just check every single file in your project, you can do poetry run Flake8. Now, I'm actually not going to hit enter because I don't want to do that. And the reason is because I have a lot of other files in here, specifically in my virtual environment. And there's actually a crap load of files you see in here, the files from every package, basically. So by default, if Flake8 doesn't know, like, hey, I shouldn't be checking in your virtual environment, we actually have to configure it for that. So how do we do that? Well, great question. If you go to new file, just going to go ahead and hit .flake8. And these, of course, are going to be our Flake8 configurations. Now, instead of typing everything, let me just copy some of these in. All right, got my little cheat sheet. Beautiful. All right, so first up, we just need to have square brackets and say Flake8. And under these are, of course, going to be all the Flake8 configurations, actually similar to EditorConfig in that way. Now, these ignores, actually, do I even want to go over them? Probably not. So the reason that I don't want to go over each of these ignores is because these are the rules that I like to ignore. However, what I would suggest that you do is I would start by not ignoring anything. And then whenever you run Flake8, what you're going to see are rules like this. E303, this is a rule that checks for too many blank lines, for example. And that's one that I like. I want to check if I have too many blank lines, so I'm not going to ignore that. However, if you ever see some issues and it's like, no, this isn't an error, this is actually how I want to style my project, then you can go ahead and ignore those. So these are the ones that I like to ignore. Again, just skimming. These are for like coding magic comments. These are for docstring. F are kind of your generic Flake rules. Anything that starts with I is a rule related to imports, and anything that starts with W, actually this, I don't even know what the W stands for. I know that these rules are line break occurred before a binary operator and line break occurred after a binary operator. So yeah, I'm not sure the significance of that W, but either way, they kind of group it based on letter. Not really that important, but yeah, that's the gist of ignores. Now for exclude, this is probably pretty obvious, saying what directories or packages do you want to exclude. Of course, my hidden git pycache in my virtual vn, and also I want to ignore this as well, my pycache. So again, this is just saying that whenever I check for these style rules, that I'm just gonna, kind of bypass all these. File name is just saying what files do you want to check for. Encodings, a lot of this is pretty simple. Inline quotes, how do you want your quotes? Max complexity, this is an interesting one. So this is related to something called the Makefile complexity, and it has actually a weird definition, but it's more or less the number of decisions that your program is making. So I say that because if you ever, if Flake8 ever complains about this check, then what you need to do is you need to go back in your code and break up your logic in some way. Simplify it, remove some if statements, basically reduce the number of decisions that chunk of code is making. And all right, so that was max complexity. These ones are pretty self-explanatory too. Max line number, max line length, multi-line quotes. And this last one, per file ignores, this says that if you ever have a rule, but you don't want to ignore it across your entire project. If you want to ignore it across your entire project, you're going to stick it here. But for example, if you only want to ignore it in a single file, and I typically have these in these files right here, where under core, project, settings, templates, you know how we had this file, which it isn't like a Python file that gets executed. It's really just a sample template that other developers can use to say what should go into my local settings right here. That is, of course, it isn't going to follow the same rules as your other Python files. So this would be a good example of one file that you want to ignore specific rules on. So now that we saw how to configure that, what I can do here is actually poetry run Flake8, since now that my virtual environment is being ignored, I'm not too worried about it scanning that. And check it out. So it did find some issues with our project, and we can actually just click into these and fix them one by one. So this rule right here, F821, this is going to check for, like it says, an undefined name in Docker. Now remember that this actually, it may look like an issue, but it's not, because just the way that our split settings were kind of structured, this is actually going to be defined. We talked about this in the last video. The point is, if you want to explicitly ignore this rule for this certain line, you of course don't want to go in Flake8 and just ignore it here, or else it's never going to check any of your files for it. So instead, right after this, if you say, just add a comment and say no QA, and then you can just specify the rule. So no QA for F821. And also it's happening on this file too, or excuse me, this line right here, then it's pretty much just going to ignore this rule for this specific file. And just to kind of prove that, let me just go ahead and run it again. And you see that these lines are no longer throwing any issues. We just have those two left, which is in this file. And I have a trailing white space. Let me actually close this. So yes, as you can see, there's a white space right here that shouldn't be there. So embarrassing. And actually, let me just go ahead and delete this. It was just for the tutorial. All right, so no white space because we just removed the entire comment. So that should take care of that. And what is this? So it was on line 15. Let me actually see what that. All right, so it was the same issue as before, where this just needs to be ignored because we're going to get that from split settings. All right, so now let me go ahead and just check everything again, and yeah, no warnings. So there you go. There is the basics of how to set up and run Flake8. Now, before we hop into the next tool, what I want to just touch on is, how I said that whenever I find myself typing poetry run and then a command, poetry run command, poetry run command, then we probably want to make this into a make command to kind of just shorten it up. Well, I'm not going to do it for this example because we're actually going to be tweaking a way that Flake8 is ran, and you'll see exactly in just a bit what I'm talking about. But that's the reason I'm not going to make that make8 command quite yet. And let me just close everything before we get started with our next tool, which is pre-commit. All right. I love keeping my terminal nice and clean. I don't know why. It's a little issue that I have. But now to install pre-commit, what we can do is, actually, let me tell you what pre-commit is before we just go ahead and start installing a bunch of random stuff. So pre-commit is a tool that allows you to manage something called hooks. Now, what is a hook? A hook is basically just a little script that can check your code for various issues. In fact, you can make your own custom hook to, have it do anything that you want. But some examples that other people developed already are, let's say you can have a hook to check that you don't have any extra white space, or you can have a hook to make sure that your imports are properly sorted. So like I said, a hook is just a script to check your code for any style or linting thing that really anything that you can dream of, you can make. But anywho, let me go ahead and install this by saying poetry add, just like Flake8, this is going to be a development dependency, and then we are going to install the package pre-commit. So hit enter, installing, and beautiful. All right, so now that we have it installed, just to verify that, yes, we do indeed. Just like our other tools, we're going to go ahead and create a new configuration file, .pre commit -config, and this is going to be a YAML file, so YAML, and check it out. All right, schema validation, mystery require repos. All right, what the heck is going on here? So let's go ahead and get some sample data in here so our IDE stops yelling at us. And the easiest way to do this is if we do poetry run, and we're going to run a command from that package we just installed, which is pre-commit, and we're just going to say sample config. So whenever you run this, it just outputs this text right here, which you can use as like a boilerplate. And you saw whenever I posted that in, then my IDE stopped yelling at me. And actually, I kind of hate how these dashes are here, but anyways, let's go ahead and figure out what the heck we just pasted in. Now at the top level, we have something called repos, and that's what we're going to be kind of posting in the first nested level right here, is each individual repo. So, I thought we were like specifying these hooks and these different type of rules. So what are all these repos doing? Why do we even care about them? Well, check it out. These repos, if I pull one up, these are basically where the hooks are going to live. So pre-commit already has a bunch of standard hooks, but let's say that you want to make your own, or some other company that you're working for, they have their own hooks. So they're basically going to be various hooks scattered across a bunch of different repos. So whenever you want to use a hook, you first need to specify where the location is. So what repo is it in? So that's what that is. And as you could see, for these repos, they usually have just on the README a list of all the hooks that you can use, but we'll get into that in just a bit. So this second one, this REV, that just stands for the revision, basically the version number. And then this last setting right here, hooks, this is good stuff. So these individual hooks are more or less the code checking scripts. So what you want to do is you actually want to read through that repo and then read through all the hooks and see what ones you actually want to apply to your project. And for this, it's, good for this example. So we'll keep those. And yeah, that's the basic structure of this configuration file. Again, we're going to be adding in a couple more repos and have a couple more hooks later on. But for now, what I want to show you is this. So what we want to do is we want to run these checks right before, or pretty much automatically whenever we commit this to a Git. Now, in order to do this, what we can do is say poetry run pre-commit install. So what this is going to do is it's going to install all of these hooks right here, pretty much to configure it where whenever we make a commit, then these checks get ran automatically. Now, that is pretty cool. However, sometimes what we also want to do is just run these manually. So what we can do for that is, for the pre-commit command, we can just say run, and what do we want to run it on? We're just going to say all files. So hit enter, and it said we have a little issue here, but the cool thing about this is, let me just go ahead and run this again. All right, so check it out. So this end of file fixer, the first time that we ran it, it said, hey, there was a warning. However, the cool thing about this tool is that it actually just fixed it for us. So where was that issue? It didn't even say what file it was, but, or was it in our get ignore file? Yeah, fixing get ignore. And another thing that I want to mention is that this, actually, let me clear this out of the way. So you know how we ran that command and we said pre-commit run all files. So this is kind of weird. Like, isn't just the default just scan all files anyways? Well, the interesting thing about pre-commit is that typically what it does is it only runs against files that have changed according to Git. Now, this is, efficient since, you don't want to check the same files if nothing's changed, but it's not always what we want. If we want to force pre-commit to check all files, then of course you are going to use this all files flag right here. So with that being said, let me go ahead and add in some more hooks right now. And let me just go ahead and paste these in. All right, so check it out. So if I clean this up a bit, so this is all the same. I also added in another repo. Now this repo right here, YAPF, it's basically because code can conform to PEP8 but still not look that great. So YAPF is a tool to help with that. And you can kind of imagine it where if you had the most OCD developer following the most strict style guide, then this would kind of be the output of it. And for this last one, this Flake8 repo, so this is pretty interesting. So here we're saying that there are some Flake8 related rules that we want you to check. And you see this additional dependency as well. I didn't mention this, but these additional dependencies, we saw it with YAF, it depends on TOML, and with Flake8 as well. These are just additional packages that the hook depends on. So with Flake8, we have Bugbear, which is for some possible bugs and designer related issues. An example of this is using the except keyword without specifying an exception type. Built-ins, this is to pretty much say don't use Python built-ins as function arguments. This is for adding coding magic comment checks. This is related to sorting and grouping imports. Polyfill for backwards compatibility, and quotes, of course, the ability to check for double quotes, single quotes, however you want to configure it. So again, to reiterate, the hooks are the actual rules or scripts for checking your code. The repo is just where these hooks live at. And although we set everything up to say, yes, these are the repos, these are the hooks that we want, there is sometimes additional configuration that we need for each of these individual tools. Now, whenever we need to specify additional configuration, we don't do it from this pre-commit config YAML file. Where we actually do it is this py project toml. Pretty cool, eh? So in essence, pre-commit config YAML says what hooks do we want to install, and in py project toml we configure them there. So for example, I know that we are going to need to configure this one, this isort tool. So for this, what we need to do is type in tool.isort. Wow, can't type today. And yeah, that's what I should rename the tool. I can't type today. And then for this is just where your configurations go. Really just like your editor config in a way. So I wonder if I got any autocomplete. All right, I'm just gonna copy this in though. So for the isort tool, I'm gonna say the multi-line output is 5, and then I just need to give a line length. And to configure that YAPF, then I'm just gonna say based on Google style, some indentation rules, and yeah. Either way, the point of this isn't to go over each of my individual settings, since this is really, a lot of this is personal preference. It's really just to demonstrate that whenever you have these additional tools and they require configuration, then you configure them in py project toml, kind of the same format that we've been following before. So now that we have everything set up, let me go ahead and just make sure everything is working. And to do that, what I first want to do is I want to go ahead and uninstall anything and then install it again. And by the way, I'm not uninstalling and then reinstalling the actual pre-commit package. This is a pre-commit command that uninstalls or installs those individual hooks. And I also want to just go ahead and, after I have those installed, manually run them. Of course, if we make a commit to Git, it's going to run it, but I just want to just go ahead and run everything by default and check it out. So a couple issues here where it says I need to change these to single quotes. Again, this one can be a double quote because I actually have a single quote here that is not escaped. And just go ahead and run this again. All right, beautiful. Now, the last thing I want to mention is, you see how we are now running Flake8 through this pre-commit? Well, since we are just running it like this instead of, running Flake8 directly, what we can actually do is we can remove as a development dependency that Flake8 package. So that's going to remove it is let me see, got too much stuff on my screen right here. So that's going to remove it is a development dependency. However, check it out. If we just go ahead and run pre-commit again, you see that we still get this Flake8 logic, and it's even pulling in those Flake8 settings as well. So this is just a really cool way that you can unify a lot of different tools under the same, like a single parent tool, I guess you could say. So now that we got the bulk of everything kind of configured, up and running exactly how we want, let's go ahead and now hop into our Makefile and start kind of making some make commands to avoid a lot of this repetitive terminal code. So the first thing that I want to go ahead is make a new command, and I'm just going to say install pre-commit. All right. So before I even start typing anything, I just want to make sure that this is tagged phony as well, and check it out. So what this command is going to do is it's going to say, type this. Let me find where it was. Here we go. So whenever I uninstalled and then reinstalled all those hooks, I want to do the exact same thing, just in a shorter command right here. So I'm going to go ahead and uninstall. And another interesting thing is that that I said that this, actually I'll show you kind of the wrong way to do it, and then I'll show you the nuance of it. So how I said that you basically have a rule, or it's more or less like a function, in that nested right here is your function body, similar to Python in a way. So the issue with structuring it this way is that each of these subcommands is actually ran in its own shell, and it's cool for a lot of things, but some things can get a little tricky that way. So if you want to ensure that both of these commands are running inside the same shell, then what you can do is you can just add them on the same line by putting a semicolon after your first command and then your second command right after. So this is looking good for that command, and now what I want to do is actually make a command for this, which is actually running pre-commit against all of our files. I want to explicitly say all the files, and for this I'm just going to name this command lint. So I'll say it's lint, and I'm just going to tag it as phony, and that this was my command right here. All right, and then after this, I also want to update my update command. So I have install, migrate, and then I want this one to install pre-commit. And then let me just go ahead and test this out. So make update. So this is what developers are going to do whenever they pull something down and they need to update it, like the first thing right after grabbing their coffee. And now, instead of running this big old poetry run, pre-commit run, all files, we can just do make lint, and looking beautiful. All right. So that is really the gist of it. However, before I let you go, I do want to show you one other thing, and that is just that the kind of benefit of setting everything up this way. that let's say that we want to go ahead and add a new hook, and this is just what I pasted in right here. Don't want to get into this exact hook, but just kind of simplify how easy it is to add. Just go ahead and paste it right in there, and then after that, to update everything, we just need to do make update. And again, this is going to uninstall and then reinstall everything just to make sure that whenever we commit to Git, that this is ran as well. And then to use it, we can just do make lint. And all right, so we actually have didn't even know I was going to pick up this error, but need type annotations for this. Can't determine, so we'll just put a star right in here so it knows what type it is. And all right, so look at that. That is how easy it is. Pretty much just add new repos and hooks right in here. Then you do make update, make lint, and you're good to go. So yeah, EditorConfig, Flake8, pre-commit. I mean, we are looking good. This code base is, you know, very appreciative. It's all nice and clean now. So yeah, that's really all we had to go over in this video. In the next video, not even sure what we're going to be doing. Maybe getting into some logging. And yeah, whatever it's going to be about, it's probably going to be awesome. So anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you then.